Hi, everyone. We are going to go ahead and get started, as I know we are wanting to get going just about on time. A few other folks, I think, are going to be joining us as we go. I wanted to first welcome you. This call is hosted by Climate Solutions, although the presenters are obviously presenting kind of as their own voices. But the intention of this call, Climate Solutions, I think, as you all know, is a Northwest-based, but not just Northwest-focused clean energy economy nonprofit. We work to stop global warming, really by taking our mission statement to heart, by bridging divides. And we need to, we know, accelerate solutions at scale in order to solve the climate crisis. And we are doing that through stopping things as far as fossil fuel infrastructure that would make things worse. We are doing that to significantly advance policies and models that will cut pollution at the scale needed to solve global warming, as well as then accelerate solutions at the pace needed to bring about the clean energy economy with a just transition. And what I wanted to do is really, in a minute, just hand it over to our presenters for the rest of the call. I just wanted to note a couple of logistical things at the start. And first, my name is Kimberly Larson. I do communications here at Climate Solutions, and wanted to just note that at the bottom of your screen, if you are participating via the computer login, you will note that if you scroll your mouse to the bottom when it's time for the Q&A question portion, there is a way to raise your hand, and there's a way to chat to the presenters at the very bottom if you roll your mouse over that way. So that's one way to do it. So the other, if people are just dialing in via just the audio, I think the only thing I can offer you if you're not on your computer is you could try sending me an email, since you have my email, to email me a question, but most likely it's going to be easiest if then you can jump onto the computer via that link with the Zoom technology to be able to chat in questions or raise your hands. And then what we'll be doing is unmuting you to ask a question via your computer audio or chat in a question and have that answered by the presenters. But I want to do is just then hand it over to our folks who are there either in Paris or just back from Paris. Wanted to first introduce Casey Golden, who is our Senior Policy Advisor. I have often said that he is also our Minister of Culture. For any of you, those who know him in spirit, he is truly that. Not just a leader within the clean energy and climate space as far as those movements, but also a true poet. And wanted to hand it over to him to kind of walk us through, as he is in Paris now, kind of his take and perspective on what is happening and what that might mean for those in the Northwest. Thank you, Casey.
Great, thanks, Kimberly. Thumbs up if the sound's good here. Does it sound all right to you, Kimberly?
Yep, sounds great.
Yay. Bonsoir, everyone. Welcome to Paris. I am going to show a few pictures for those of you who have video. You can see we are, all of the speakers are either still in Paris or recently returned from Paris. We're in crunch time here where the negotiators are in plenary session now on the final text, and tonight will be an all-nighter, and tomorrow will probably be an all-nighter too before we have an agreement. And many of the key issues are still on the table. It has been an amazing thing to be here in Paris. Our Parisian hosts have been extremely gracious, especially after the attacks of November 13th, and welcoming the whole world here. And it's an amazing thing, whatever happens in the negotiations or otherwise, to watch the whole world to get together and then spend about 2 weeks depriving themselves of sleep and see what they can come up with in the end. But it truly is an incredible thing. 140 heads of state were here earlier in the week, and everybody from everywhere is part of this. As you can see from the slide, it's the conference on changement climatique. French is the only language beautiful enough to make a looming global catastrophe sound like a bath gel. I want to show you a couple other pictures, but they don't seem to be advancing. This is terrible. Hold on with me one sec. There we go. A little messaging seminar. This is it doesn't look like it in this picture, but this is I don't know what, guys, a 30, 40-foot giant mechanical polar bear at the entrance to the blue zone of the conference. It is very cool. But as Kimberly will be quick to remind us, it's not all about polar bears, hence the expression on my face. Better messaging. in the hall. We see a lot of this, and a lot of on all the country pavilions are really inspiring stuff about real collective will for action. It's an amazing thing to see. The wonkiest street theater in the world occurs on a regular basis inside the Blue Zone. One of the many U.S. youth delegation who's here, and they do these crazy street actions inside the negotiating space every day with this kind of stuff on it. And it's all about the text of this document that the whole world is trying to focus on improving. And I'm now going to spend a little bit, and this is the lead-in to a little bit on the content of the negotiations, and then on, just a little broader perspective on what's happening here and what kind of signal it sends for our the work we've already done to get here, and more importantly, the work we have to do going forward. There are really only two issues in these negotiations. One of them is they call here, they started as this kind of a sanitized word, they call it ambition. And it has to do with the level of commitment to emission reduction, primarily in the agreement. This sign is the sign we use to signify to each other that the appropriate scientific goal for the kind of the red line for dangerous global warming should be shifted from 2 degrees centigrade to 1.5 in recognition of the fact that it's now clear that 2 degrees means the difference between survival and inundation for many of the world's low-lying areas. And it looks, in fact, like this was a major negotiating demand of the world's most vulnerable countries and the climate justice community. Over 100 nations signed on to it, and it didn't look very likely that it was going to go anywhere, but it looks likely now that it will be in the final text in some form, the 1.5 degree target. I have to say, though, that I think as important as that is, that people are paying attention to scientific reality, the commitments in the agreement, the actual emission reduction commitments, add up to something more like 3 degrees. And so the real measure of whether the world is now turning toward a science-based commitment is partly in the number, but it's also partly in some other critical parts of the text that kind of operationalize this long-term goal. There's a big negotiation going on now about how quickly these emission reduction commitments will be reviewed and updated and improved to get from where they are now, which is about 3 degrees, to about 1.5 degrees. The legal framework and the mechanisms for accountability among the countries, so that we have some sense that our progress toward these goals is being measured well and consistently, and there's some way of holding each other accountable for them. Some more exotic parts of the text, but that are important in the sense that they really operationalize this commitment and give us a sense of confidence that folks are going to follow through on this. Those are kind of the important details being ironed out now. So one big issue in all of that was about what we call ambition or emission reduction. The other big issue is equity. Because it's this is a core principle of the UN treaty that underlies these negotiations, and it's just obviously true that countries are in different positions with respect to their historic emissions, their level of economic development, their ability to participate in solutions, and the future of their economies and their exposure to impacts. And so an effective and ambitious agreement also has to be an equitable one. The biggest and highest profile piece of that is climate finance and the commitments of the already developed countries to help the less developed countries both achieve their economic goals, develop their economies, and invest in a clean energy economy, and also cope with the unavoidable climate impacts that are already in the pipeline. And these two goals, equity and ambition and finance, are not trade-offs against each other. Without finance, without equity, it will be impossible for the less developed countries to deliver on their emission reduction commitments. So there's a positive synergy between these two things. Loss and damage is a very contentious issue at the end of the negotiations, the extent to which the developed world will actually take responsibility for the damages that are now unavoidable and help the less developed countries figure out how to cope with them. and then a whole kind of sequence of issues about how other critical equity goals and principles are reflected in the actual negotiating text. I think and hope and expect that Jeff Johnson will talk about the very important language around just transition. There's critical language about human rights and indigenous rights that are still a little bit in limbo about whether they'll be in at all, and if they're in, whether they'll be in a part of the text that has any real legal significance. And those are the kinds of things that they're now on the floor negotiating about. Let me turn just from the content and go back to our first slide and just say that as important as the ultimate text is, and as this agreement is, and as the sort of formal outcome is in terms of the Paris Agreement, it's maybe not the most important thing that's going on here right now. The agreement is going to be a very important barometer of how far we've come in the climate fight and how far we have yet to go. It is not the fundamental motive force of how far we are in the climate fight. It is going to be significant for us, I think, back home in our own efforts. But I think of the text as a bit of a lagging indicator, to be honest. It reflects how much political space the national governments and negotiators have to move in the direction of climate solutions. And the good news is, I think it's going to reflect that they think they have more space than they did before. I think this agreement's going to bring forward a lot more commitment than the Copenhagen Agreement in 2009, and reflects the good work we've done to create political pressure to advance the clean energy economy so people feel like solutions are possible, to raise public awareness about the issue and the impacts. All of that, I think, will be reflected in a better agreement. The bad news is it's still not nearly as good as it needs to be. It'll be 1.5 or 2 or some hybrid of the two for the goal, but the real hard commitments in this thing, and even those lack legal full legal enforceability, are going to be to emission reductions that take us more in the neighborhood of 3 degrees centigrade. A big improvement, but progress in this game, to be honest, is not success, because 3 degrees is still an unmanageable global catastrophe if you're following the science. But the hopeful thing about all that is that, before this COP and starting again on Saturday, the ball is going to be back in our court to create the progress and political space that moves us to move toward ever more successful and aggressive international agreements. And from that perspective, I have to say, when you walk around Paris and you walk around Le Bourget, where the conference is, and you can't help but notice that the national governments and the national negotiators are not the only locus of power in Paris right now. Cities and states are here in force. Michael will talk about that. Businesses and labor unions are here in force. Indigenous communities, communities of color and faith. There was a big Black Lives Matter die-in over in the Green Zone today, and the primary chant was 1.5 to stay alive. And so there's a real sense that, globally and domestically, the movements for social and economic justice and the movement for climate sanity are converging in important ways. And most of all, I think, we're walking the talk. We're demonstrating to the rest of the world by our actions that we are serious about climate solutions, and helping each other raise the bar for action throughout the world, not just through our national negotiators, but through our own actions in our communities. And my message here, and my main function in our formal functions and our press conferences, has been to send a message to the national negotiators that, we're pressing them for a stronger agreement, but we are not waiting for them. We will do the hard work. We've been doing the hard work. And all we want and hope and expect and demand from our national negotiators is that they deliver an international agreement and national commitments that affirm our power to do what we've set out to do, and that create the collective will and the collective context in which our efforts back in our communities make sense and add up to solutions at the scale of the problem. And I think that message is being heard loud and clear. And as a result, I think we're going to get real progress and a better agreement. We're going to have a hell of a lot of work to do when it's all said and done. Kimberly?
Thank you, Casey. It reminds me this morning when I saw one of the news releases about the draft text and the draft text, it reminds me how the policy is not the quest and the text is not the quest as well. So I appreciate your comments and perspective. I actually am going to, I wanted to just flip the order because Michael Armstrong with the City of Portland actually has to leave us at the top of the hour, and I want to make sure he has a few minutes. So we're actually going to next shift to Michael because I think we're going to lose him just in a few minutes. And if he could lend his comments, he is the sustainability manager for the City of Portland. And I think people have tracked that Portland has really been leading and advancing the clean energy economy right there in their city borders and doing also a lot of incredible things recently with passing resolutions of stopping fossil fuel infrastructure as well as advancing a climate agenda that's very meaningful and powerful there in the city. So I wanted to hand it over to Michael for a few minutes. He's just back from Paris. He is the one of our presenters who is actually back in the US. Everyone else is still over there, but I wanted to just hand it over to Michael for a few minutes before you have to leave us.
Great, thanks so much, Kimberly. Thanks, Casey. Is the audio okay? Nodding, great, all right. So perfect framing, Casey and we're all on pins and needles to see what comes out. I also think your point that the agreement, it is important, but it is not the whole story, is a very important understanding. And so from the city's perspective, I think our big message in Paris and the work we're really resolved to continue with is that cities matter. So last week I was in Paris together with Mayor Hales, almost 500 cities joining with the City of Paris, ICLEI, C40, the acronyms I can barely keep track of, essentially to elevate the voice of cities and the commitment that we have already made and that we are prepared to follow through on. So from the Northwest, in addition to Mayor Hales, we had Mayor Robertson from Vancouver, BC, Jessica Finn-Coven, the director of the City of Seattle Office of Sustainable Environment, former Climate Solutions staffer, a really great ally in all this work. And, a lot of the cities' initiatives there, it was definitely, it was quite a spectacle, I will say. But there was substance as well, and both parts of that are important because the spectacle, I think, conveys both the commitment and also the invitation to other cities and other mayors in particular to get on board. And, I think one of the most impressive commentators was the mayor of Paris, Anne Hidalgo. And very early on, she said, I have this to say to the negotiators, we cities will be with you, but we need you to be with us too. And so for the first time, the language of the draft agreement does acknowledge the role of cities. We'll have to see what stays into the end, but I think there is a recognition that the agreement is national, but much of the action needs to happen at the state and at the local level. We are getting results already. We are committed to doing more, and we really are committed to elevating equity as almost a co-equal outcome with carbon reduction. We're not going to solve climate change at the expense of our residents, at the expense of our businesses who already don't have equal opportunities and services. So for us, climate action really is paired with advancing equity. And I think, the happy news here is that at the city scale, many of the solutions do exactly that. We've got transit, we've got efficient, affordable housing. Walkable neighborhoods are one of the most democratizing things we can do. And I think you'll see consistent commitment to that across all of the leading cities, not just around the U.S., but globally. So for us, of course, there's been a lot of talk about the road to Paris. I think we all understand this is really the road through Paris. I think a good illustration of that is this, the reason I need to get off this call in just a second, which is that we have West Coast mayors in Portland right now, just a few days after returning from Paris. We've got the mayors of Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles, Eugene, and Portland. They're in Portland today for 2 days. Day one is around homelessness and housing affordability. We've got the HUD Secretary Castro here. Day two is around climate action. There's a recognition that these things are linked. And so we all will be somewhat distracted tomorrow during our climate conversations as we're also watching the tweets coming out of the all-nighter in Paris, eager for a really strong agreement, but also prepared to deliver at the city level, both through individual city action, but also through coordination across cities. So we really want to see strong state action in Washington, in Oregon. We're encouraged by some of the initiatives that are coming forward, and we're results to everything we can in our power locally. So with that, I think I will go back on mute, and I will have to sign off here in just a second, but I really appreciate the opportunity, and I'm happy to follow up, presumably by email, if there are specific questions around Portland and some of the other cities' work. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Michael. And yes, I was going to offer that if there are any folks who are participating in the call who then have questions for Michael, you can then email those afterwards, and then we can make sure that those get to him and answers back out. So if you have to leave us before we get to any of that, really appreciate your time. Thank you. I'm going to
thanks everyone.
Jump back up now and wanted to introduce Jeff Johnson. He is the president of the Washington State Labor Council. He earlier this year really won my heart when I was at a hearing for the Carbon Pollution Accountability Act in the Washington State Legislature, and got up in front of everyone and said, this might be the most important bill I testify in my entire life. And I thought that that was just an incredible statement from a labor leader here in our state, as far as talking about the need for climate action to really create jobs and move through that just transition. And now here's Jeff just continuing to lead in all sorts of venues and in all sorts of ways, not just in our state, but now over abroad in Paris. And Jeff, really appreciate you taking the time to join us on this call, and wanted to hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Kimberly. This is a great honor, and thank you for the opportunity to participate. This truly raises my exposure, my education, and my commitment to the climate justice fight. It's also my first experience in dealing with an international forum with all of its complexities and intricacies and whatnot. It is quite the spectacle over here. So I get to be part of the International Trade Union Confederation delegation, and we meet twice a day, once in the morning to kind of brief on what happened the day before, kind of get some assignments, and then we meet later on in the afternoon to get a sense of where things are at. I also get an opportunity to spend a fair amount of time participating in the civil society actions and events. So it's been quite fascinating and quite educational for me. There are three main issues that the labor unions have been focusing on over here. The first one is what Casey started with, which is the ambition piece, both the level and timing of carbon emission reductions. The second piece that we have great interest in, of course, is level and timing of the adaptation or the financing of adaptation to climate change. And then the third and final piece, it's not the only pieces we're interested in, but the third major piece is the just transition, human rights, or what comprises kind of the solidarity language of the report. On the ambition levels, or the carbon emission reduction levels, the latest draft that we saw yesterday, and we know another draft is coming out tonight, it does call for a dialogue in 2018 or 2019 about ambition levels, but there's no mechanism proposed for resetting ambitions. And at least in the discussions in the labor community, this is a big mistake. Given the contribution levels that countries are willing to make right now. As Casey mentioned earlier, it adds up to 3+ degrees Celsius, and that's only if all countries actually follow through with the contribution levels that pledged. And there's really no mechanism for accountability yet, so it could be quite a bit higher than 4 degrees. As a consequence, the labor discussions revolve around there needs to be a meeting between now and 2020 where there's a real mechanism for sitting down and readjusting these contribution levels and increasing them significantly to either put us on a real path to less than 2 degrees Celsius, or what we hope is a better path, which is no more than 1.5 degrees. In the text of yesterday as well, there does seem to be a cycle for reviews of every 5 years, but one thing we all noticed was there doesn't appear to be a start date. And when I talked to Todd Stern today from the U.S. delegation, he said they recognized that, and that would be one of the discussions in tonight's plenary. On the second piece on financing and supporting the most vulnerable, quite a bit of discussion around differentiation and the need and responsibility of developed countries paying their fair share for climate effects in lesser developed countries. And there is language in the, while there are various options in yesterday's text, the one that is preferred by us reinforces the $100 billion of annual dollars from developed countries going to the adaptation fund for lesser developed countries, but using that as a floor only, and the money's going up from there. But there are other options in the text that we hope don't go through, which basically leave countries up to their own assessment on what to contribute and their capacity to pay. And also, while there's a review process for the adaptation fund as well, there's no mechanism for assessing what type of revenue we need and verifying that level relative to the level of needs out there. I participated in the part of the Civil Society Citizens Summit this past Sunday, and I was really taken by something that a young French trade unionist from the public sector said, and I quote, she said, "If the planet were a bank, they would have saved it by now." And it was particularly poignant because of the speeches and testimony that was given at that summit, and then the next night by Jeremy Corbyn and Naomi Klein, that kind of detailed the level of bank financing, international bank financing of fossil fuel projects relative to their investment in renewables and the great imbalance of funding towards fossil fuels, the level of bank speculation investments over investments in the real economy, and then the amount of world money that is sheltered in bank tax havens and not taxed, and therefore not available for climate adaptation and general economic development, but instead many countries, resorting to austerity measures, which simply exacerbate equity issues as well as any attempt to get equity and climate change together. And all of this juxtaposed to estimates of what it's going to actually take to do global mitigation and adaptation. I was reading the International Energy Agency predicts that the world needs $1 trillion a year between now and 2050 to actually finance a low emissions transition. I mean, these numbers just kind of blow you away. So clearly $100 billion a year is just not adequate. The third piece that we've been working on is to try to get just transition and human rights language, definitions of decent work and quality jobs into the operating portion of the text. In fact, Article 2, it's not there yet and may well not get there. It's in the preamble. The solidarity language as a group have been working with the civil society groups and encompasses human rights, indigenous people's rights, the right to health, gender equality, food security, ending hunger, and just transition. Right now, just transition language is in the preamble. So is the human rights and gender equality and indigenous rights language. However, that language is still bracketed, and it may stay there, or it may not. And if we get these pieces into the preamble, that's good, but it's not great. From our way of thinking, these equity pieces really should be at the core of the climate debate. Obviously the effects of climate change we see on physical nature, but it also necessitates an economic transformation, and that plays out on human beings, and it does so unequally. So we have an opportunity to reinvent our economies and to bring everyone along or not. I think that the thing that has most struck me here is is getting a better sense of, as I meet trade unionists from all around the world, Brazil, from Latin America, from the EU, from the Scandinavian countries, from Africa, from Japan, from China, is that there seems to be an increasing political will on the part of labor to increase their efforts around both climate justice and economic transformation, seeing them as two parts of the same issue, and making that a greater part and mission of the labor movement, that either we do a transition that's based in principles of justice and equity, or we perpetuate the inequality that exists right now. And if we wait for others, so to get to the point that Casey raised, is not simply about what's in the text, it's about what we do back at home in our countries, and how we communicate with each other. Because if we wait for things like just transition to get into operational portions of text, then we've waited too long. We've waited to the point where the powers to be will basically dominate and profit off of what they consider a just transition. And I don't believe that will be one that we would consider just. So we need to increase our efforts on the ground. Anyway, thank you for giving me this opportunity. This has been a huge learning experience for me, and I've been able to report back each day to our affiliates back in Washington State. I really can't wait to get home to engage in further discussions with them on what we do next as a labor movement with our environmental and climate justice allies. Thank you.
Jeff, thank you so much. Really greatly appreciate your participation and all of your leadership on this. And that quote just strikes me that if the world were a bank, it would be saved by now. Thank you. I wanted to turn it over. We're going to move to questions in a few minutes, but we have a really great and different perspective that I think complements Jeff's really well. So Tim Miller is based in Oregon, works as the CEO of Enhabit, which used to be, people might know, Clean Energy Works, does a lot of great work on efficiency. He's a really great leader within the business community, and he is also over there now and going to provide a few minutes of his perspective too. So I'd like to turn it over to you, Tim.
All right, thanks everybody. Hello friends, it was fun to see all the friends and colleagues on the list of RSVPs for this call, so thanks for tuning in. Our organization is actually called Enhabit, and we used to be called Clean Energy Works, as Kimberly mentioned. I also wanted to say thank you to Climate Solutions for making it possible for me to get the credentials to be in the blue zone where the negotiations and a lot of the real action was happening. So thank you. I'm really happy to go forth actually, because a lot of the things I want to talk about touch on everything else that everyone set up. And thank you all. Thanks Casey for framing the negotiations, and Jeff and Michael for what you've covered. Just by way of background, what we do is home renewal. We help homeowners make their house more comfortable, more energy efficient, more resilient to all kinds of changes. And we do that by connecting a homeowner to a contractor and a lender, and we do customer service and help them pull all those pieces together to easily make their home more resilient. And that includes, of course, deep energy efficiency work, which is really all about climate and carbon emissions. So, and we do that work, connecting back to what Michael was saying, we do that work in Oregon in partnership with the city of Portland and other partners in Oregon, including Michael and his team in the city there. And we do that work in Seattle with Jessica Finkoven and her team at the Office of Sustainability and Environment, who Casey mentioned, I believe, and Michael mentioned. So we're an example of that connection of local communities. We're also we've been supported by the state of Oregon. So and state of Washington work as well. So we're an example of that work of local subnational work becoming work right on the ground, doing work for people in their homes. And we've done 4,800 plus homes in Oregon and hundreds more in Washington. So that's and in Washington, again, in partnership with Cascadia Consulting and other folks there. So this becomes real work on the ground. To pick up on a couple of the themes that you all have mentioned, one factoid that was shared there in Paris, and I actually got back Monday night, so I'm back here in Oregon now. One of the factoids that was super powerful for me that was shared in Paris was that women and girls in Africa spend 40 billion hours, billion with a B, hours a year getting water for their families. That number was powerful to me because what that conveyed is imagine if water gets only slightly more scarce in Africa due to climate change. What happens to that 40 billion hour number? And what happens to the tens and tens of millions of families who are dependent on that water? And they're already walking 2, 3, 4 hours to retrieve that water. And that's not a whole lot of water because it's the water that one person can carry. So that little factoid to me was very powerful. Hopefully that rests with you all. It goes to the equity considerations that Jeff spoke about and the rest of us spoke about, and the social impacts of this. So this is very much a science and climate and CO2 discussion, but it's also very much a human discussion about how will the wealthy nations help less developed countries adapt? How will we help them pursue their mitigation strategies? How will we potentially provide loss and damage support when the floods and storms and droughts and other challenges come? So these are very, very human, very social discussions as well. And it comes to roost right here on the ground in Oregon in social ways where the work that we do, for example, is very much about creating equitable jobs in work toward addressing the climate challenge. We have to bear in mind that while we're investing in that work, we need to do it in a way that doesn't enhance disparities in our communities, even here at home, but actually helps to repair those disparities. So we make sure that we're creating good jobs. These are local jobs. We provide training. We make sure wages and benefits are great for folks doing that work. So, and we partner with communities to make that happen, back to one of Michael's messages about, communities making this work happen. So it really does go from a social level at the global level to social and equity considerations at the local level. I would say also, Jeff's point about if this were a bank, we wouldn't have gotten this far, it would have been saved already. One of the, in the challenges of hearing that, hey, if we added up all the national commitments, it would only get us to down to a 3-degree increase, where we really need to be aiming for a 1.5-degree increase in global temperatures. So some pretty challenging discussions going on, and hopefully we will get those 5-year conversations happening where we can close that mitigation gap that ambition gap where we are doing all that we need to do. I love that double-speak term, ambition gap, but it says a lot, actually. But one of the actually shining areas of opportunity, I was pleased to hear the business community globally, maybe not so much, Wall Street yet, but the global financial community, insurance providers globally, investors globally, folks who are dealing with pension funds handling hundreds of billions of dollars of pensioners' money, are thinking not only about whether those pensioners are going to have monies available in 20 or 30 years and what kind of returns they're going to have, but in what world will those pensioners be able to spend their retirement money? The world has to be good enough and enjoyable for them to deploy those dollars. Anyway, we have the business community, at least some aspects of it, some portions of it, rallying and getting focused on this. They know that investing in fossil-based companies or companies that have a huge climate risk is a bad investment. It's a bad idea. We know that the planet is rallying around addressing this challenge. There's going to be a price on carbon globally, not one price, but a lot of regions eventually linking up in their prices. So carbon-based businesses are a bad risk. Giant investors with trillions of dollars that they're handling know that that's a risk. And we know how fast transitions can happen when we get our economies and our incentives aligned around addressing those challenges. So that to me was a ray of hope. If we can get the incentives aligned right, we can make a faster shift than maybe we imagine. So let's be hopeful about that and continue the work on the ground where we're creating jobs locally and thinking about people globally. With that, I'll pass it back.
Thank you so much, Tim. And I want to apologize. Speaking of flooding, I experienced some of my own last night because we were stuck on I-5 until over midnight. So we had just a very long drive, and I apologize. I am operating on little sleep, and I'm sorry that I got your new name wrong. Enhabit.
It's a new name. It's a new name. Folks are still getting used to it.
I know it's a new name, but I should have it ingrained as a new name, because one of the things I just wanted to say, we often talk about bridging the ambition gap. We also talk about bridging the confidence gap, that the clean energy economy is happening now, and we need to demonstrate it's happening now, and it's irresistible and scalable and inevitable. And I think your business is a great example of that, as far as happening now within everyone's homes and in our communities. So it's greatly appreciated as far as your work in the business sector and in the efficiency sector too. So thank you. So I wanted to now turn it over to some questions. We have a few minutes, and there's a couple different ways that people can ask questions if you're participating via the Zoom link on your computer. One is just chatting in a question, and I'm going to go ahead with one that's been chatted in as people then kind of adjust to the technology. You can scroll your mouse down to the bottom of the screen to then enact the chat functionality at the bottom of the screen. You can also, if you go to the upper left corner, you can raise your hand and then we can unmute you so you can ask your question directly via audio to the presenters. So first, I'm going to go to a question that was chatted in by Larry. It says, Casey, have you attended the meetings of the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition? How is it navigating the differences between carbon markets and carbon taxes, since it supports both? Is that being talked about in Paris? Oh, Casey, could you unmute yourself, please?
Yeah, sorry about that. There's a little background noise here. No is the answer to the question. There's an unbelievable amount going on that I've missed, as everyone who's here can attest. The conference center in the Blue Zone is actually quite a ways from Paris, from central Paris, where an awful lot of other stuff is going on. So that was the one of the things that I couldn't get back and forth to, so I missed that. There is, the answer to the second question though, is there is a lot of talk about carbon pricing. I was asked about it at a press conference yesterday, and in the side events, which are, we call them side events, but they're numerous. The room that I'm sitting in, this is the backdrop for one of the conference rooms, and I don't know what, guys, there's probably 30 or 40 conference rooms between 100 and 500 in size, most of them full of side events all day. And there's a lot of talk about carbon pricing in those. I was asked about it at a press conference yesterday. It's not part of the agreement. It's not part of the text. And maybe it should be in some way, but it's just never been sort of within the scope of what the UN thinks about what it's supposed to negotiate, because it sort of falls to the level of national policy making or subnational policy making, as they call it, that needs to be implemented by other jurisdictions once the international agreement is met. So, people spend a lot of time talking about the text here, and so that tends to dominate the discussion, here within the conference center. But around that formal discussion, there is a lot of talk about carbon pricing.
If I could just follow on that with one little comment, and I've been attending a lot of those sessions that Casey referenced on that topic, but the acknowledgement was that it's difficult for the global community to have a reference to units or tradable units or prices or anything like that in the agreement, because some of the economies don't like that notion of a market-based approach, even though the broad majority do. So what you see in the language are broader terms like mechanism, or other terms which are a way of acknowledging the importance of various strategies and approaches without specifically calling out markets, but rest assured that markets are happening everywhere. Something like 19% of the globe's economy is now included in various markets. More and more of those markets are being linked, not just from California to Toronto and Quebec, but across the EU and across broader expanses of the planet.
Yep. I think we're up over 20% now, and as China begins to implement, China's experimenting with it, but is set to implement with a lot more in 2016, and of course, that bumps the global percentage up close to half by 2016, we anticipate.
I'd actually then like to move that pivots really nicely to a question that Stephanie Swanson asked. I'm going to flip her question because one of them was about China, and will China's status as a developing or industrialized nation be resolved in the final text? And then I have a second question from her, but why don't we first I don't know if that could be addressed quickly, and then we can move to that second one from her.
Should I take that, guys? There is, it's kind of in the weeds, but one of the things that's being debated now is the language that Jeff referred to about differentiated responsibilities, which is, those are sacred words in this international treaty, common but differentiated responsibilities. Under the treaty itself and the Kyoto Protocol, what the basic way that that's operationalized is to split the world into two annexes, Annex 1 countries and Annex 2 countries. And the differentiation is mostly about whether you're in one of those two categories, and it's based on level of development. In those original agreements, China was in Annex 2, the least developed countries, and had there's a clear and I think fair understanding that the more developed countries have to go faster and go first, because that's only fair. China has grown so much since then. Their annual emissions have overtaken the U.S. as the world's largest, although not their cumulative emissions. And it's, of course, cumulative emissions that are what the atmosphere cares about. But having said that, I think everyone recognizes that it's no longer appropriate to just have one giant category that includes, China and Burundi. So there is a lot of discussion. There was language added actually to the China-U.S. agreement that talks about, I'm not going to be able to get the words exactly right, but according to national capabilities, even within those two categories. And the U.S. is actually working very hard to make sure that we don't have the kind of rigid separation between Annex 1 and Annex 2 going forward that prevents us from getting, the rapidly developing and high emission economies like China, and China is unique, of course, into the game, both with emission reduction responsibilities and to some extent with investment and finance responsibilities, which China has expressed some willingness to step up to. So I think there will be progress on that front.
Great. I want to let the participants know that we have a couple questions in the queue from the chat, so I'm going to keep moving on those. We probably have, maybe time for one more in addition to what's already queued up, if somebody has one other final question they want to chat in. But I wanted to go, what I'm going to do actually, Stephanie, I want to hold your question for the final question because I feel like it's a really nice one to wrap up on. And I'm going to instead pivot to one that I think Tim and Jeff might want to then address of, what are you hearing coming from US-based Fortune 500 companies that have a multinational presence beyond the financial sector, agricultural manufacturer, and any of you can speak to this? Are they stepping up to support these commitments to 1.5 degrees?
So I don't know anything from over here in Paris, but on Monday in the International New York Times, it was reported that a group of CEOs met over here and invited the executive director of Greenpeace to join them and talked about a zero emission target by 2050. Companies, so I'm going to read this, such as Harley Davidson, Virgin, Natura, L'Oreal, Marks and Spencer, Unilever, and the like. So I look forward to learning more about how they plan to get from here to there. But on the surface, from the report, certainly a welcome addition to those arguing that we need to get on a path to 1.5.
And I would add, thank you, Jeff. I would add also on Monday, while we had the mind-blowing display of 150 heads of state in one photo shoot, which was pretty angsty for me, being that we were in Paris, and I was very glad to see that done and break up that picture, that photo op. Anyway, along with those kinds of commitments of all those folks showing up and saying this is important, we had announcements from sort of the corporate sector, really the the billionaire sector. Bill Gates and friends saying that they're going to be investing in technological advancements to move this forward. I already referenced the awareness of internationally, but I think also in the U.S., investors realizing that fossil investments are risky, and therefore the cost of capital for as dollars are removed from those risky investments, the cost of capital for those businesses will go up. Their ability to invest will go down, and that will all be good news for everybody. And then finally, I would say, even as carbon markets are taking off with policy support and in the real economy, more and more corporations are imposing on themselves an internal carbon price for their own decisions. So if they're deciding whether to build a factory here or a mine there or a pipeline here or whatever, or even an offering of a new service, they're looking at what's the world going to be like with a cost of carbon. So that's influencing corporate decisions even before those carbon prices really exist. The smart corporations are building that into their thinking now. And then, of course, one last thing is those investors are requiring boards of major corporations to take a look at the corporation and be sure its act is together. And more shareholder movements on responsibility around climate are winning the day. It used to be that 20 or 30% of folks would vote in a shareholder meeting for responsibility in these areas. Now more and more of those votes are actually winning. So corporations are having to respond to their shareholders and make the right choices.
Yeah, I think we have time for 2 more questions. One comes in from Eric, which is actually, I love this question. Any of you or all of you could speak to it, but we do want to save time for one last one after this, so just note that as far as the timing of your answers. Any insights into new ways to pressure state politicians who drag their feet?
Casey, that's got to be you.
Got anybody in particular in mind? State,
I think we have many people in particular in mind.
Yeah, I assume by state we're not talking about, here state means nation, but
Correct.
We're talking about U.S. state
level, Washington and Oregon in particular, given the folks on the phone. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I know that back home, one of the things holding in Congress right now is the oil export ban, which would, of course, make some of our state officials' lives quite miserable. I don't know if there's, it's pretty late in the game on that, but if there's any good work people can do back home, please do. Excuse me. We had folks may know I'm also the chair of 350.org, and we had a press conference today launching a campaign that will unfold particularly in May of next year called Break Free. That we wanted to do it here to make clear that the action doesn't stop with the text or the global agreement. And after Copenhagen, there was an extended period of regret and recrimination before there was much action after Copenhagen, and it's not going to be that way this time around. There is going to be a very active and robust grassroots movement all around the world. I think if you look at I forget what the website is, but if you just search Break Free, stuff should start coming up about what that might look like. It was just announced today, and it will be actions all over the world. The individual actions aren't all planned yet, so you won't see that yet. The divestment movement is still obviously incredibly strong. I don't think the agreement itself is going to bring particular new leverage, except insofar as it to the extent it points toward 1.5. I think we got to think real hard about in both Washington and Oregon, but honestly particularly on Washington, about aligning our state targets with international commitments. They're not aligned at this point with 2 degrees, and they need to be better aligned with the emerging international consensus about what's safe. There's one other thing I wanted to mention, and it slipped my mind for a moment. Sorry about that.
if I could, if I could wave a magic wand and bring, Senator Erickson and others from our state legislature over here to hear some of the testimonials, particularly from people of color from the southern countries, that maybe more than anything else might actually help educate them. But short of that, I think back home, the more we do to put together the narrative of what's happening in our own state, from the flooding to the glacier melts to the forest fires, and start painting that picture with real people's stories. We just have to keep chipping away at people's understanding that way.
Yeah.
And
I think, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I don't want to pile on too much, but Jeff, just to pick up on that theme, I grew up in Minnesota, and I have friends there who aren't inclined to necessarily be stressed out about climate change. But now when they see a couple winters without snow, it gets very real. So I'm just wanting to follow on Jeff's point that, to me, it's almost like we could be very effective at a town hall level, where you're on almost a county by county basis. You could talk to one county about how they're going to be risking their forests due to beetles and dryness, and another one where they're going to be risking their crops, and another where they have to be worried about water and snow and snowpacks. So I think it is that notion of it can be very, very local, these impacts, and very human, as you mentioned as well.
Yeah. Let me just mention real quickly, Kimberly, sorry, that I think it will be very important, especially for electeds who oppose climate action, to demonstrate how much the world showed up. Often we hear, well, we could act, but other people won't, or it's really, China and India, and I think Paris is going to leave very, very few places to hide, in the sense that the world is really showing up with very meaningful commitments. We might want to send around, Kimberly, I don't know if you're going to send any follow-up, but the infographic from Climate Nexus comparing, Copenhagen to this, and how far we've come in terms of the world's commitment to emission reduction. There's just no excuse, especially for a region like ours, to be sitting on our hands waiting for anybody else at this point.